Space, the final frontier. These are the maps of the starship Red Quills. Its continuing mission to try and make maps of every different genre that we possibly can across the TTRPG spectrum. Hello, adventurers, and welcome back to the Red Quills. My name is Ryan, and today we are going to be starting with a sci-fi map. Now, this one is a little bit different from the other maps that I've done, namely because generally speaking, we've been delving into fantasy. We've been talking about different variations of fantasy, like high fantasy or post-apocalyptic fantasy, or even horror fantasy. But in this episode, I am going to be responding to a very common fan request, which is for a sci-fi map. And if it goes particularly well, it honestly deserves its own series of maps, because there's so many different things that you need to map in a TTRPG campaign in a sci-fi setting, like the ships, like the bases, space stations, galactic sectors, the galaxy itself. And there's honestly just such a broad variety of areas that need attention that this is just my first sort of opening foray. This is the entree to the main course, if you will, but it is something that I tried to stick as much information as possible into so that you could use this as the basis for a campaign. Now, there are any number of sci-fi TTRPGs out there, some of the larger ones based on such acclaimed TV series and movies as Star Trek and Star Wars, the big two giants, but there are, of course, a great deal of others that are based on other fandoms or have their own IP as well. But in this particular case, because it's just a starting point for a thought experiment about how to map this kind of thing, I kind of based it off more of the Star Trek, Star Wars kind of area, and keeping in mind that map making relies on being able to travel a certain distance within a certain amount of time. If you can travel instantaneously to another location, or if you travel at the speed of plot, which is what tends to happen in Star Wars, then a map becomes a lot less useful in the way that it is. You need less of a map and more of a list of locations. So in this particular case, I'm going to be using a lot of the concepts from Star Wars and how they travel around, and a lot of the science that Star Trek uses, kind of melding them together into one source material. And I ended up coming up with something that looks really, really good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down why I made it in this particular style, what challenges I needed to make, and what I would suggest that you do when you create your own maps for a TTRPG in a sci-fi setting in the future. So strap yourself in, get out a dark blue sheet of 180 GSM watercolor paper, and let's start. Now for this particular map, I worked entirely in white, and only at the end did I add in some black ink, and that's just because it was a little easier for me. But you can do this entirely in white pens. I used both white acrylic pens and the white out pens that I use for the others, the Posca pens, and a white pencil as well to give it some texturing. Now, if you wanted more of a fantastical approach as well, I should say now that I have already done a map of a world tree, which is my approach to creating the astral plane in D&D, and is a much more fantastical approach to that, much less science-based. So if you want something like that uses mythology rather than science, I would suggest checking that video out. But for this one, because it's science, I needed to consider all the different variables that go into stellar cartography. Thank you, Star Trek, for that concept. And what that meant was I needed several inserts. I'm going to be mapping a single sector of the galaxy for this particular map, which is honestly quite wide. We're looking at an area of about 15,000 light years by 10,000 light years, which is honestly, by any measure of our exploration of space, enormous. By Star Trek's exploration of space is still quite large, and by Star Wars' exploration of space barely has anything in it at all. It is only one small sector of the galaxy, but for the purposes of this map, because it's so large scientifically and so small plot-wise, I needed to fill it with details and have an understanding not only of how everything looks from the top down, because the Milky Way and most galaxies, most spiral galaxies, are of course a disk shape, but also how everything sat in altitude corresponding to one another and where they were located in the wider galaxy. So those three details, firstly their latitude and longitude, and then their depth within the disk, and then their location within the entire disk, were all pieces of information that I needed to have on the map. And those are the inserts on the right-hand side. And then I also need to add on, and again, we haven't even gotten into the practical making of this map yet, but then I need to consider how I'm labeling different locations so that you get as much detail as possible. When you create a fantasy map, the details that you need to be considering are the size and racial disparity of different towns, where the roads are, where the shipping lanes are, what kind of natural forests and fields you'll be getting around them, the location of mountains and that kind of thing. When you get to space, you still have a lot of natural obstacles like nebulae or asteroid belts or pulsars and black holes. But the stars themselves, of course, there are so many, and most of them, statistically speaking, won't be inhabited. But over the size of this map, which again is 15,000 by 10,000 light years, so that's an enormous area, will ideally have somewhere around 50 points for a map this size. And so I wanted around 50 points that I could label and have them differentiated from each other. Now, there are all sorts of ways that you can differentiate your systems. I decided against coloring them according to how we categorize stars on a alphabetical scale from A to O. So in this particular case, all I did was make the size of the star, the dot, relative to each other, and I had particularly inhabited systems of a civilization that was notable as a hollow dot. What I mean by that is, if we assume that you have a crew that's, zipping around like they do in, say, Star Trek, then you will occasionally come across a planet in which the inhabitants are not yet at a spacefaring level, or in which the planets are inhabitable but don't have a population that is intelligent. And so those are the ones that make up the majority of planets throughout the system. Planets that are, in this particular instance, colonizable but not inhabited. But the hollow dotting system that I'm using, like the ones for Photodiscan or Teleperses, they have much more infrastructure within them, and I wanted a way to kind of measure that. And so I came up with an alphabetical and numerical system that denotes how many bodies are in a solar system, how large they are, and where the civilization is focused. So for instance, let me break this kind of down for you. In the Photodiscan system, there is 6 planets, 2 outer subplanetary bodies, Pluto-sized, for instance, and 2 of those orbiting bodies are inhabited. So if we've got a solar system of roughly our size, the 6 planets, we're not really going to go into too much detail. All we really need to know is that one of the planets, the 4th planet from the star, is inhabited with quite a large civilization. And one of the outer planetoids, the one that's closer to the star instead of the outermost planetoid, that also has quite a large civilization on it. So that is a civilization of a population of roughly about 1 billion on a planet the size of Pluto. And then 1 planet over, there is another quite large civilization that's a little bit smaller. So what I did was I made that numerical system to tell us what size bodies are in the system. 6 planets of at least Mars size, and then 2 more that are smaller than that, Pluto or Europa. Quite small, large enough to make themselves spherical, but not large enough to have life-sustaining properties. And then you've got 2 of those that are inhabited, and I need a numerical way of saying that. So what I've got is 1 to 6 tells us how many planets there are. A and B tells us how many planetoid objects there are. And then the 4.2 and A1 denote the populated planets. 4.2 is the one closest to the sun, has a civilization of the 2nd ranking, and A has a population of the 1st ranking. And that numerical system, by the way, because 5 is at the bottom with 5 million, means that any smaller settlement than that can just fly onto the radar and you can populate them as you like. This is really just measuring cities on a fantasy map rather than every single village. It allows you to have trading posts on fairly uninhabited moons, things that won't stand out on a galactic sector map like this, but then can allow you to move the plot forward. So we've got, for instance, Coruscant is going to be on this map, but something like Bespin, which is a mining planet, won't really be on a scale large enough to show up here. All of which is to say that I came up with that system, that alphanumerical system, to categorize not only the different planets, but how large their inhabitation was and what state of development the inhabitants were at. And if you want to use that system for your own maps, please do. It's quite complicated to explain. I hope that this has kind of gotten it through. If you do have any questions, stick them in the comments below, but I have written that out in a little bit more detail in the accompanying Patreon post, where you can download the digital version of this map. You can check that out in the link below. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, please go to like and a subscribe. Let me know in the comments if you do want me to do that sci-fi series. So now that we've talked about what's on the map, let's talk about the process of making the map, the tools that you'll need, and what I kind of took into consideration in putting on the map itself. Because when I did a lot of research, I found that sci-fi TTRPG maps don't have a broad breadth of subject matter. You've either got big galactic maps, or you've got very specific, planetary outposts and spaceships and things like that. And I may end up doing a spaceship diagram, but for the purposes of this, I was like, well, that's, in terms of maps, you're either mapping a world or you're mapping a town. There's no in between there. But if you are exploring the galaxy like you would in, Star Trek, then you're going to need something a bit more zoomed in. And I wanted to explore how we would denote that kind of thing. So we ask ourselves, what do you need to denote on a stellar map? The first thing, of course, is those planets. Those are the ones that I'm going to be spending a lot of time doing. But after that as well, I'm going to add other symbols. So firstly, the triangles, which represent space stations which aren't accompanying a large planet. And those are our way stations, the places where trade routes or massive, intergalactic corridors for travel will connect. Then we've got our pulsars, things that you can use as interplanetary navigational beacons, right? And in, actual astronomy, those are hugely significant in understanding position and space-time as well. And honestly, we won't go into the science there, but I would recommend putting them on your map as well. I also have a black hole on the map. And that's because I wanted to put one on there and not necessarily because it's plot significant, but I love black holes and I wanted to have an area that was sort of, for pirates. And I have a lot of those in my fantasy maps, so I wanted one here. Why would an area be uninhabited for miles and miles around? Because of the presence of the black hole itself. After I've gone through and I've made all the symbols and I have labeled everything, I'm going to come through with the white pencil and do some nebulae, right? And overall, whether or not this impacts on your gameplay is entirely up to you, but it mainly just kind of fills the area out and makes it look a little bit more full than just the labels. I wanted something that gave it a little bit of topography without changing the actual gameplay itself, and the nebulae will do that. I did as well add in some area names like you would on a regional map, things like Titan's Grave or Santar Vale or the Windward Break, names for large areas in the sector that aren't associated with a particular species or empire or association. Then we come in with the white pen again and I do the nations, if you will, for this particular map. And again, in space, that's different. You're dealing with not just horizontal borders, but a large three-dimensional pocket of space. You can have the entire galaxy being ruled by a single empire, and these could be, sectors that have different governors, or you could do it like Star Trek does. It's entirely up to you. But for this case, I wanted to put 5 on there, a couple of different empires and unions, one area that's entirely just free planets that are unaffiliated with one another, and that area of that no man's space for where pirates will shelter and you can get a lot of more illicit goods. And then going through them, I have the different borders of areas of security with different kingdoms and empires, or more hostile or dangerous areas. And again, bearing in mind that space is a very hostile environment, even for a ship that is designed to endure there. The area around a black hole, for instance, is somewhere that most ships wouldn't go unless they had very good reason to, or areas around particular other stellar phenomena could be avoided as well. And then, of course, we come in with the trade routes, and for the purpose of this map, that is the roads that you would see on the regions. It could just be that they are, clear routes that can be pre-programmed into a hyperspace drive. It could be that these are long strings of interstellar neutrino flows, whatever kind of science jargon you want to put on there. That's where most of the ships will head through from one system to another, and that's where the function of these space stations will really come to a head. I've only got a few of them here. If you wanted to make yours a bit more detailed, you absolutely can, but I didn't want to overpower the system. So using just the white then, We have a variety of different symbols that can show us different landmarks. We've got borders and roads and a lot of different labels for the regions. And then I can turn my attention to the other two inserts. On the top right is the galactic insert I'm going to go through with the white pen. And again, I'm just using a reference point of a spiral galaxy. It's not our own. I'm just going to make it up as we go. But between the white pencil and the white pen, I'm going to give it a bit of oomph. So I'm going to divide it into sectors. I'm going to actually gerrymander it a little bit as I go through here and then start to label and add in a bit more stars there. The important part of this map is not really to give a lot of detail onto the galaxy as a whole, because I'm assuming that you're only going to need this one sector map. The idea is to just show how wide a scale you're operating on within a galaxy, how small this particular sector is in relation to the wider galaxy, and have areas that you can reference people being from that are really far away, which is all you really need a world map for when you're starting a campaign anyway. Then I'm going to go down, I'm going to go into what I referred to before, which is that sort of vertical line. When you look at a map of a galaxy, it is important to remember that we are working in three-dimensional space here. Our galaxy is 100,000 light years across, and it is much, much thinner than that, only about 3,000 light years wide, 15,000 light years wide at the thickest point. I'm assuming slightly different dimensions here. It's about 6,000 or 7,000 light years deep and about 90,000 light years wide. And so this area is, a fairly significant part of the galaxy, but it's not filled with a huge amount of depth. If we were going in the central galactic point where the big bulge is, that's going to be about 3 or 4 or 5 times as thick as what we get out here. So if you're mapping that central area, it's important to remember that. If we do like this map and you want me to explain some concepts a bit more in depth, I will mention that I had a kind of concept for labeling stars as being red or blue depending on the depth, or even using tracing paper to show the different depths there. There are a number of ways you can do it, but I thought this way kind of encapsulated that at a glance, and using the insets made it look a little bit more like a computer screen, which is really what I wanted to do here. Then I'm going to add in on the bottom right a little bit more of the lore and help everyone to understand more about that numerical system that I use to denote the populations and the planets of the inhabited systems. And so then we're pretty much done. And as I add the finishing touches and the labels, I do want to, again, come back around to talking about how and why we would use a map like this, because it depends entirely on the sci-fi TTRPG that you're using. But the idea that I wanted to approach was that you would be able to give this to your players. This is a player map, not a DM map. It's something that you can hand to them in the first session and be like, cool, this is the area of space that we are exploring. You have a ship. These are the points that you have been to before. This is where, your garage is, where you get the ship repaired. And otherwise, there are points around here. It means that you, when you're creating a sci-fi world, you don't have to make an entire galaxy, which has, about 100 billion stars in it, which is absolutely enormous, a little bit too large for the purposes of this, and it's too easy, I think, for a TTRPG group to get distracted doing that. You can limit the playing field by having only a limited number of inhabitable worlds, of course, but this is a way of narrowing that down for a smaller scale TTRPG. All right, so let's summarize the process that I used to make this map. Firstly, you want a very large sector map, an area in which is the locality that you'll be exploring during the campaign. You want to have the reference into the rest of the galaxy. If you are in space, everyone is going to be aware that there is a wider galaxy out there. It's good to have a reference for that. You can have it a bit smaller than this one, but I wanted to add a fair amount of detail. You need to reference the fact that things are at different depths, because you can have 2 points that look from the top down as if they're right on top of each other, but can be, 3,000 or 5,000 light years apart. That sense of depth really reminds your players that you're working in actual space. You can turn the ship in whatever direction you like, and you want to be able to reference that. And then once you've kind of done that, remember the hierarchy of importance of what you're labeling here, because there are so many stars out in space, and most of them are, just the Sol star or binary star systems, and they don't have planetoids, and those that do have planets won't be inhabitable. You need to be able to filter out the systems that don't have anything on them. Only focus on labeling the systems that actually can sustain life or have minerals that you'll be wanting to mine. Now, I didn't have a system in this particular map to denote minerals or various resources, and I did consider that. But again, there's a lot of detail on this map already, and I didn't want to clutter it up with different concepts too early on. If we revisit this, I'll talk about color grading or different symbols that we could use in order to talk about that, but we would want to focus on one or two specific resources like warp crystals or kyber crystals or whatever it is, whatever kind of crystal your sci-fi TTRPG uses. And last things last, I did want to reference the fact that I didn't use any digital program to make this map, obviously, and that might be because I am filled with the hubris of Icarus, because this is obviously supposed to be a digital medium if you're exploring space. But as always, I say, if you want to make something, make it with your own hands. If you enjoy that process, I do. And I find that I work better and invent better when I'm working with my hands. If you want to take this idea and then put it into a digital program where you can layer things up on different sheets digitally, so you can show the different depths that way, you can absolutely do that. You can add or remove different icons. There's a heap of different ways that you can do it, but this is just for adding something to paper. So let me know what you think in the comments below. I hope that you found it very interesting. If you want me to continue with that, let me know in the comments below. We have more maps coming in the genre series. Thank you again to my patrons and my YouTube members. I couldn't do this without you guys, and I will see you next week for a continuation of the genre map series. Happy mapping. Source material. And we ended up coming out with something that I think is honestly very, very sexy. You can't say that about maps, right? People are going to think you're weird. And I can't. And I ended up coming up with something that looks really, really